We shall commence our discussion by studying about Indian federal system. In the Indian federal system, there are three levels of government: center, state and local. Each governs the same citizens, but each level has its own jurisdiction, legislative, judiciary and financial powers. Indian constitution is described as a quasi-federal. India has 29 states governed by their own elected political party. Indian Federation was evolved as the two-tier structure until 1992. The statutory recognition to rural and urban local governments was accorded with the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments in 1992. Article 267 to 281 of Part 12 of the Indian Constitution deals with the center-state financial relations. Over the period, the centralization of fiscal powers has grown. The transfer of resources has accentuated the powers of the center, and the states have mounted a joint attack on the center for its dominant financial position and asking for rearrangement of center-state financial relations. The degree of centralization of revenue and expenditure in India is found to be of very high order, making the states heavily dependent on the centers. The states are closer to the people and therefore the people's requirement have to be fulfilled by them. The transfer of resources is necessary for the state so that they can undertake the expenditure expected of them in their state. It is found that the scheming of intergovernmental transfers is fairly complex in India in view of the wider interstate differences in the economic endowments and levels of income. The nature of central financial transfers to states has created conflicts and controversies between the center and the states. This module discusses the center-state financial relations in general and would highlight the major issues pertaining to the center-state relations. After studying this module, we shall be able to understand the institutional framework of the center and state relations in regard to expenditure responsibilities and tax powers between the center and the state. Learn about the existing center-state fiscal institutions. Understand the major issues of center-state financial relations. Let us understand the institutional framework of center-state relations. First division of expenditure responsibilities. Fiscal relations between the center and the states have been shaped by 7th schedule in the Indian Constitution. It describes the legislative, executive and judicial power of the center and the states through the union, state and concurrent list. The subjects listed in the union and the state list broadly defines the expenditure responsibilities of the center and the states respectively. They are as follows. First, union list. Exclusively under central government relates to the functions of national importance like defense, atomic energy, external affairs, communication, constitution, organization of the Supreme Court and the High Court, elections, currency, finance and exchange, foreign trade. Second, state list. Exclusively under the state government which looks into the life and welfare of the people such as public law and order, local administration, education and public health, fisheries, rural development including agriculture, etc. Concurrent list. Under the purview of both center and the state government. It includes forest, economic planning, population and family planning, commercial monopolies, etc. The Article 246 of 7th Schedule of Parliament has special powers to make laws regarding the matters enumerated in the Union list. whereas the legislature of any state has special powers to make laws for the state concerning any of the matters enumerated in the state list subject to the other clause. With regard to concurrent list, both the union and the state legislatures can make laws in respect of the subjects enumerated in the concurrent list, but any union act can override a state act in the event of a conflict between the two on a matter in the concurrent list. Hence, the union has the supremacy over a wide-ranging legislative field. Second, division of taxation powers. Under Article 246, the 3 list includes the power of taxation of the union and the states also. Most broad-based and progressive tax handles have been assigned to the centre. The centre has residual tax powers. A number of tax handles have been assigned to the states as well, but from the viewpoint of revenue productivity, only the sales tax, which is known as VAT, is very important. The Constitution also identifies that the state's tax powers are insufficient to meet their expenditure needs and therefore provides for the sharing of revenues from the central taxes. The union list includes, among others, the taxes on income other than agricultural income, excise duties except on alcoholic liquors and narcotics not contained in medical or toilet preparations, customs duties, corporation tax, estate and the succession duties other than on the agricultural land, taxes on the capital value of an asset, rates on the stamp duties on transactions in the future markets and stock exchanges, etc. The state list includes land revenue, tax on agricultural incomes, estate duties, excise on alcoholic liquors, taxes on the sales or purchase of goods except newspapers, taxes on vehicles, on professionals, on luxuries, on entertainment, on stamp duties except those on the financial documents, taxes on land and building, taxes on entry of the goods into the local area, excise on alcoholic liquors and narcotics, taxes on sales and consumption of electricity, toll, etc. The concurrent list does not include any important taxes. The centre enjoys all the residuary powers of taxation even when they are not listed in any of the 3 lists. There is no overlapping of taxation powers of the centre and states, though there may be some overlapping of state and local taxation, but with an overlapping of geographical areas. A new regime in the indirect taxation with the proposed goods and service taxes, which is known as GST, which will replace the existing system of value added tax in India, will challenge the fiscal autonomy of the states and thus the fiscal federalism. The first discussion paper, known as FDP in 2009, proposed dual GST, one levied by the centre and the other levied by the states. It also listed out the taxes to be sub-armed under the central GST and the state GST. The taxes proposed to be subsumed under CGST are central excise duty, additional excise duties, excise duty under medical and toilet reparations, service taxes, additional custom duties known as countervailing duty and special additional duty. Cesses and surcharges are also proposed to be subsumed under CGST. The taxes proposed under SGST are VAT or sales tax, entertainment tax if not levied by the local bodies, luxury tax, tax on lotteries, betting and gambling, cesses and surcharges as far as relating to the goods and services, entry tax not in lieu of octroi and purchase tax, taxes on alcohol, tobacco and petroleum products are proposed to be kept out of the purview of GST. The FDP has not suggested any revenue neutral rates for the CGST and SGST. Third, center-state fiscal institutions. Indian federalism is characterized by constitutional distinction of revenue and expenditure powers among the 3 levels of government. However, there is asymmetry between the functional responsibilities and the taxation powers between the union and the states. The center is assigned taxes that have higher revenue potentials, whereas the states are assigned with more functional responsibilities. To address the issue of a gap in the resource allocated to states and their expenditure responsibilities, the Constitution provides an institutional mechanism in the form of Finance Commission, the Planning Commission, now NITI Aayog, the Interstate Council, the National Development Council, and the State Finance Commissions. The President appoints a Finance Commission every 5 years or earlier to review the finances of the Union and states and recommend the devolution of taxes and grants in aid of revenue to them for the ensuing 5 years. Additionally, the Planning Commission also gives support to the state based on the formula determined by the National Development Council, and various central ministries give specific purpose transfers to the states. However, the Government of India created National Institution for Transforming India Aayog that replaces the Planning Commission on 1st of January 2015. The Constitution recognized the need for coordination among governments in the shape of an interstate council set up under the Article 263 of the Constitution via the Presidential Order in 1990. The council was not formed in the first 40 years of the independence. Despite strong recommendations by high-powered panels like the first Administrative Reforms Commission in the 1966 and the Sarkaria Commission in 1983. M. Punchi Committee was set up in 2007 to look into the new issues of center-state relations, keeping in view of the changes that has been taken place since the Sarkaria Commission had last looked at the issue of center-state relations over 2 decades ago. The Constitution opted for a strong central government with a federal setup. The most important was the adoption of planning as the strategy of development, with the center taking the lead. The Planning Commission, a body set up through an executive order of the state dated 15th of March 1950, to make an assessment of the material, capital and the human resource of the country, and to formulate a plan for effective and balanced utilization of the country's resources. In August 1952, National Development Council was set up to strengthen and mobilize the effort and resources of the nation in support of the 5-year plans. However, to look after the needs of the disadvantaged states and to provide them adequate resources on equitable and administratively feasible arrangements, the Constitution provided for the appointment of a Finance Commission as per the Article 280 of the Constitution of India. Till date, 14 Finance Commissions have submitted their reports. It is intended to address the vertical imbalance in the financial resource between the center and the states, and to address the horizontal distribution of resources among the states. The Finance Commission makes an assessment of the revenue and requirement of the center and the states on non-planned revenue account. Grants in aid are recommended to those states which are assessed to have a deficit on their non-planned revenue account after tax devolution. Moving on to discuss the major issues of center-state financial relations. First issue is the institutional weaknesses. The institutional structure underlying the central transfers in India shows there are various instruments available exclusively to and used by the center to make transfers to the states. This may be a reasonable indicator of center's potential control over the transfer mechanism employed for making transfers to the states. The distribution of transfers across the states have been quite inequitable. Thus, different transfers carry different degrees of progressiveness. Multiple agencies like the Finance Commission, Planning Commission and the central ministries use different methodologies, evolve different types of transfers and attach different terms and conditions. Though their overall effects are highly advantageous to the fiscal health of the states, there are certain adverse effects of such flows on state finances. Some of the important aspects are: first, in the case of statutory transfers, the actual proportion of shareable central taxes to be made over to the state is specified by the Finance Commission and Parliament acceptance. The significant part of the tax shares, the centre is not obliged to share it with this. The Constitution does suggest grants in aid, but the amount, kind and direction of this assistance is decided by the centre. There is a strong centripetal bias in the constitutional structure of the central state financial relations. Second, the state approach of Finance Commission to revenue deficit is gap filling approach. This diminishes the incentives of the states to raise revenue receipts and revenue expenditures. Thus, it discourages fiscal disciplines. This has been addressed by the FRAM Act. Third, in the case of plan transfers, modified Gadgil formula is applicable only in the case of transfers for the state plans. The whole state plan assistance is dependent on the approval of Planning Commission, therefore uncertainty is much larger. Uncertainty increases still further with the growing discretionary transfers. The continuing expenditure on the plan schemes beyond the 5-year plans becomes the committed expenditure of the states and add to their fiscal burden. Since there is a premium on plan expenditure, state governments have a tendency to underfund maintenance expenditure to inflate the plan size. This results in the poor maintenance of public assets created in the past and poor quality of public services which are outside the plan. A further complication is due to the steep increase in the revenue component of the plan expenditure over the years. While the grant loan ratio of central assistance is still 30:70, as a result, the debt servicing burden of the states has risen significantly. Fourth, the role of Finance Commission and the Planning Commissions need to be redefined. Despite the balanced regional development being a common objective for the commissions, it is pursued through the equity by ignoring plan expenditure and plan grants, which is very much a leveler of the regional disparities. The existing center-state institutions and the forums lack dynamism and mechanisms of coordination to solve the interstate and center-state problems. Second is the equity issue, vertical and horizontal. The Constitution has recognized that the states have larger expenditure responsibilities and the resources they have at their command are not adequate to meet such expenditures. On the other hand, the centre had greater access to most of the important revenue source with fewer responsibilities. The divisions of functions and the assignment of tax powers between the centre and the states have resulted in a significant degree of vertical imbalance. Fiscal transfers are intended to address the vertical imbalance in the financial resources between the centre and the states and to address the horizontal distribution of resources among the states. It checks the regional economic imbalances, promotes economic growth and encourages the states to mobilize the large revenues. However, it is evident that the federalism has weakened not only in the vertical relationship between the centre and the state, but also in the horizontal distribution. Huge differences have resulted in the per capita devolution of share of central taxes and different states. Although the proportion of transfers have increased to 32% of the central taxes in 13th FC, the redistributive impact is regressive as it makes richer states better off and poor states worse off. The devolution principle does not respond to the needs of the states, and states are not rewarded for their efforts of raising the resources. Thus, the regional inequalities persist not only in the per capita income but also in the public services. There is a dichotomy between the plan and the non-plan segments of the government budget, but also the revenue account of both the center and the states suffers from chronic imbalances. Third is efficiency issue. Efficiency should be conceptualized in the context of welfare function that may be augmented by the government expenditure at the different levels. In India, some states are more developed than others is partly due to their initial historical and geographical advantages and better natural endowment. Similarly, the states that are backward are not so due to the lack of efforts of inefficiency. However, pre-devolution surpluses may not reflect efficiency. Pre-devolution deficits do reflect in some cases at least financial impropriety and mismanagement. The states use their financial resources in a less efficient manner. It has now become common in India that both developed and less developed states has spread to the center also. The result has been that distribution has served to achieve distributional inefficiencies and not to reduce the disadvantages. Another limiting factor has been the separation of the plan and the non-plan expenditures. The Finance Commission had to deal with the non-plan expenditure if the Article 275 grants have to be used for deliberately leaving surpluses. Plan expenditures has to be taken up into the account. The primary objective of the revenue transfers is to correct the fiscal deficiencies of the states so that the level of the essential public services do not differ too much across the regions and not to neutralize the differences in endowments. The fact, however, remains that the capacity of a state to provide basic services depends crucially on their infrastructure, physical and human, and if the levels of the public services are to be equalized or made comparable, massive investments should be required to build up the infrastructure in the backward areas. Fourth is financial autonomy issue. The demand of the states for more autonomy results into conflicts and frictions between the center and the state. Sarkaria Commission of 1983 had suggested some measures to normalize the center-state relations, and M. Punchi Commission, which was constituted in 2007 on the center-state relation, its proposal are still hanging fire on this aspect. In this situation, if there is a demand for greater state autonomy, it would create instability in the government and the developmental works would be affected. The following aspects are relevant for the financial autonomy. First is inadequate central transfers. The Constitution has recognized that the states have larger responsibilities and the resources they have at their command are not adequate to meet such expenditures. Their need for resource for development grows faster than their own revenues, which have made them perpetually dependent on the center. The central transfers are inadequate to bridge the imbalance between the center and the states. The dependence on the central transfers may vary across states depending on the capacity to generate their own resources. A significant part of the resources go to the states in the form of loans. Loans have to be repaid by the states, and their growing share in the central transfers imply heavier burden on the state finance. This issue has assumed importance. For the high income states, the dependence on central transfer varies from 1/4 to the 1/6 of their revenue receipts. Second, restriction on borrowing by the states. Under the Article 293 of the Constitution, state governments require the approval of the center for borrowing from the market if they are indebted to the center. The center has been setting the limits on the market borrowing of states as a part of the overall pattern of the plan financing. according to the 13th Finance Commission, borrowing limits for the states to be calculated by the centre on the basis of recommended fiscal reform paths for the years between 2011-12 and 2014-15. States have been complaining from time to time that their share in overall market borrowing has come down significantly. The share of market borrowing of states should be increased from low proportion of about 15% currently to 50%. Moreover, Article 293 of the Constitution should be amended to provide more flexibility and independence to the states in regard to market borrowings. The Reserve Bank of India also restrains the state government's flexibility in market borrowing in a number of ways. The most restrictive condition imposed by the RBI is that market borrowings cannot be used to finance revenue deficits. Now we will discuss the discretionary transfers, which are centrally sponsored schemes and the central planned schemes. The proportions of discretionary transfers have increased over time. It displays not only political bias but also the growing central expenditure on the state subjects. The discretionary transfers in terms of central planned schemes and centrally sponsored schemes have grown at the expense formula based transfers. Growing discretionary transfers from centre have severely restricted the states in drawing and implementing the schemes according to their priorities and the needs of the people. Since the state governments have to bear a part of the expenditure behind such schemes, in most cases the states find it very difficult to make proper allocation of their own resources, keeping in view their own priorities. Moreover, conditionalities are often imposed through these schemes, which impinge upon the autonomy of the state. Consolidation of the large number of centrally sponsored schemes could improve the flexibility to the states and reduce the resource distortions. Now, we will study the FRBM legislation in detail. The enactment of Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, known as FRBMA, by the centre directs the states to bring in discipline the management of public finances, which has added pressure particularly in improving the productive assets of the poorest states. Alarmed by the deteriorating fiscal situation, the centre had enacted the FRBMA in 2003, which became operational from July 5, 2004. The main obligations of the centre under the Act and the rules framed under the Act are the elimination of revenue deficit by 2008-9 and reduction of fiscal deficit to no more than 3% of the GDP by 2008 and 9. There was slippage in meeting these targets because of the fall in the revenue following the global slowdown, increase in the food and fertilizer subsidies, and higher expenditures necessitated by the farm loan waivers, pay revisions following the recommendations of the 6th Central Pay Commission, and the fiscal stimulus packages put in place as a contrary cyclical measures. Fifth issue is the regional disparities. India exhibits glaring interstate and intrastate disparities with respect to the development potentials, resource endowments, entrepreneurial abilities, geographical features, etc. This is a matter of serious concern to the objectives of inclusive growth. The pressures and tensions, widening gaps in the quality and extent of public services across states are testing the stability of the federation. The inter-regional income disparities have grown the differences in developed and less developed states. The division of responsibilities between the centre and the state are constitutionally defined but has led to the vertical and horizontal imbalances. A number of committees have gone into the issue relating to the growing imbalances in regional development and made recommendations to address these issues. The changing ground realities in and around the Indian economy shows many challenges to the working of centre-state relations in India. The first challenge is the growing disparity in the level of development with respect to the fiscal capacities and provisions of public services across states. Secondly, the federal structure stability is constantly challenged due to the constant demand for fragmentation of states, formation of non-viable states that get trapped into a permanent dependence syndrome, degenerate the competitive among states, resulting in erosion of tax revenue and extremely inefficient use of public funds by all levels of the government. Thirdly, the greater role cast on the states in economic development. With the major portion of the investment envisaged to come from the private sector in 5-year plans, states are required to put in place the necessary enabling conditions such as the provisions of adequate infrastructure to attract the private investments. States which have taken proactive policy measures and having better infrastructure facilities have been able to attract private investments. States failing to attract private investments have lagged behind. Let us now summarize what we have discussed in this module so far. Fiscal relations between the center and the states have been shaped by the 7th schedule in the Indian Constitution. It describes the legislative powers of the center and the states through the union, state and concurrent list. Indian federalism is considered by constitutional demarcation of revenue powers and expenditure responsibilities among the 3 levels of government. However, there is an asymmetry between the taxation powers and the functional responsibilities between the union and the states. The center is assigned with the taxes with higher revenue potentials, whereas the states are assigned with the more functional responsibilities. To address the issue of a gap in the resource assigned to states and their expenditure responsibilities, the Constitution provides an institutional mechanism in the form of Finance Commission, a constitutional body, the Planning Commission, the Interstate Council, the National Development Council and the State Finance Commissions. Center-state financial institutions use different methodologies, evolve different types of transfers and attach different terms and conditions. The existing center-state institutions and forums lack dynamism and mechanisms of the coordination to solve the interstate and center-state problems. They have not been able to address either vertical or horizontal imbalances. There are few issues which remain in the domain of center-state financial relations, such as multiple channels of transfers, limited scope of finance commission transfers with the exclusion of planned revenue expenditure and planned grant from their purview, methodological weakness and too much reliance on the gap filling approach, and multiplicity of the objectives failing to focus on the main objective of reducing disparities.